Ladies, gentlemen, and Sherlocks, would you please take your seats? We're about to start the next session. Thank you very much.
Hello. So my name's, everyone's coming up with me. Okay. Hi, my name's Eric Toller. I'm with DFR Lab and also with Bellingcat. And before I get started, a couple of housekeeping items. Firstly, I've been told to tell everyone to keep your name tags, because if you go outside for a cigarette or whatever and you don't have this, then you are locked out. So keep this with you. It's your badge, your key card to get back in. And also keep it for tomorrow, too. Don't lose it tonight when you put it in your backpack or your luggage or whatever. And also, if you have the app on your phone, which has been plugged relentlessly this morning, you can submit questions during the event. So we're going to have a short Q&A session at the end of this session. And you can ask questions while the event's going on, and then we will answer them at the end, maybe, if you're one of the lucky ones. OK, so I'm going to talk a little bit about open source in general and a few case studies from DFR Lab that we've done in different areas that show off some of the capabilities of open source. And in each of these examples, there's one video or photo in particular that kind of breaks open the story. So first of all, I'll introduce my colleagues. First, we have Nika, who leads up the digital research for the Baltic region. Lucas, who works some in the Baltics region, but also down in Syria and other conflict zones especially. And finally, Dinara, who also works especially with disinformation and bots in the Baltics, among other subjects. And we're each going to be presenting a short case study, rapid fire, that kind of exemplifies what open source is and how we conduct our investigations. So if you haven't figured it out already, open source information is any information that's accessible to both equally to the analyst or writer and to the audience. So in a utopian vision of open source, there's transparency between the person writing and doing the analysis and the reader, so that they can be, more transparency, then you can cross-check each other. If there's an error, then in the utopian vision at least, the reader could find it and assess it and fix it. So some of these sources are, of course, social media, social networks, Facebook, Kontakte, Jednoklassniki, Twitter, and so on. Increasingly, we see information on closed or semi-closed messaging apps like Telegram, Viber, WhatsApp, and other places. And especially in some countries, this is the main source of news and information. We're seeing this a lot more, and these are harder to assess with open sources, but can still be done. And also a lot of more sophisticated tools like CrowdTangle, little CT on there. And when we pull all this information for conducting some kind of investigation with verification or assessing a war crime or whatever, we look at all the information available. So even if they're from sources we may not trust normally, so you see a few on there you may recognize, like Newsfront, Sana, and Ana News. Even if we don't like a lot of their ideological leanings, a lot of times they have footage from conflict zones that are hard to access. So when we do open source research, we synthesize and contextualize all this information together. It's not just one photo. Usually it's not just one photo or one video. It's reports on the ground from witnesses who witnessed something on social media, videos from some of these kind of new gonzo news outlets, traditional reporting from CNN, BBC, or so on, satellite imagery, and so on. So you synthesize it all together, so it's not just single source information. It brings everything together. So for the first example, we have Nika. I'll hand this off to her.
Thank you, Eric. So open source breadcrumb sometimes comes in the form of image. And when it comes to you, first thing you do, you verify it. So the case I want to present is when it happened in February, when Associated Press published a report alleging that Governor of Bank of Latvia is involved in big corruption and also has Russian ties. This image served as a proof And the question was, it came in very unexpectedly, was it photoshopped? That was the first theory of Latvian online digital engagement space. So we use this open source tool called Photo Forensics. We run the image scan. How it works, if you do image error analysis, in the top you see how an original image should look like. There are some highlighted parts of the image which show the difference between edges. Like if colors are too different, they are kind of highlighted. And when the image is modified, like in an example at the bottom, 2 books are edited here, here, and a dinosaur there, then you see that they really stand out from the image. Let's take a look if this image was digitally altered. The error analysis, it does not really show up. This tool is open source, everyone can use it, and this is just an error analysis. More sophisticated digital altering can't be there, but this is what we had, so we tried to use another approach, and thanks to some Latvian journalists, by contextualizing, we figure out that this image was a wrong evidence to making the case. So Dmitry Pilshikov, the head of Research Institute for Russian Arms Company, sitting by the table with Ilmars Rimšēvičs, the governor of the Bank of Latvia, was allegedly connected or worked for Sergei Chemezov, which is friends with Putin. So probably Pilshikov is also friends with Putin. Is it so? So if we lay it out on a timeline, 2010 is the year where the image was taken. 2011 is the last year when we can find any open source information about Pilshikov. In 2012, the institute he ran was joined with a Russian joint stock company, which was then acquired by Rostec, Chemezov is head of. So were they connected in 2010? The timeline shows otherwise. So this was the case how a real image was fake due to context of how it was used. So thank you. I'll pass it on to my colleague, Donara.
Thank you. Hi. So the greatest part about being a part of the Digital Sherlocks network is that you don't have to work alone anymore. So for most of us, the digital breadcrumbs don't come from open source, but rather from partnerships that we have with journalists or with other people who are working in the space. So today I will tell you about an example from the Malaysian elections that took place last month. So what happened a couple of weeks before the election was that we received an email from a Reuters journalist based in Malaysia. And in that email, she asked us if we could verify 2 hashtag campaigns that were targeting the opposition coalition. What she found was that there were 2 hashtags, both spread a hostile message towards the opposition coalition, and one was Say No to PH, which is the opposition party, and Defeat PH. And the journalists had a suspicion that bots were amplifying those hashtags. So we looked into the hashtags, and we found that, between April 12th and April 18th, those 2 hashtags generated more than 41,000 mentions. And that was done by 22,000 users. And then we decided to look into how many of those users were real accounts and how many were bots. So what we found was that 98% of 22,000 accounts involved in the hashtag campaigns were bots, and only 2% of the users engaged in the campaign were real people. Now, how did we confirm that? So we used a social listening tool, social media listening tool called Sisymus, and we extracted the raw mentions of the hashtag to see if the accounts followed a similar pattern of speech, which is the first indicator that, that the traffic could have been automated. And here's what we can see. All of the bots involved in the campaign used the exact same pattern of speech, where they would use one hashtag and the other, and then tag between 13 and 16 real users to make sure that the hashtag and the campaign spread beyond the original bot network. Furthermore, we also found that the majority of the users who were involved in this hashtag campaign and were bots had alphanumerical handles. This is a very easy giveaway that allows us to conclude that the accounts were bots, because an algorithm, which is what how bots are created, cannot tell the difference between a real user's, a real person's name and Q345689, because they cannot contextualize that information. And very often, when you are creating a botnet using a simple algorithm, the algorithm will provide you with a bunch of alphanumerical handles as opposed to real names, because they are quite hard to make up. The bots that we have identified shared a 9-second video that we decided to investigate. So it was a video that had two stills. One was a still of a Malaysian flag with Malaysia the sites in the corner, and another was a picture which appeared to be an image from a political rally. We found that the image was taken at the manifesto launch of the Barisan Nasional, which at the time was the ruling coalition manifesto launch. So what we have found was that this hashtag campaign was targeting the opposition party and promoting the, at the time, ruling coalition. Did it have any impact? Well, the bot hashtag campaign generated 2 million impressions, and that might seem like a lot. But how many real users were involved in the actual campaign? Only 2% of the 22,000 accounts, which adds up to about 440 real users. So what we found essentially was that although there were many bots targeting the public, and wanting people to get involved in the hashtag campaign, only 2% or 440 of those users were real people who got tricked into spreading the hashtag because it was promoted by bots. The coolest part of the story is that our research resulted in real-world impact. So what happened once we published the article was that Twitter removed the 22,000 bots who were targeting the Malaysian elections, and the Malaysian communications ombudsman said that they will investigate the use of bots in political campaigns, and will make sure that this doesn't happen ever again. So this is the kind of work that's very rewarding, because you can see a real-world impact happen because you wrote something and you did some research online without leaving your home in Latvia. So it's really exciting, and I'm very excited to welcome you to the Digital Sherlocks Network. Now on to Lucas.
Thank you, Dinara. Digital breadcrumbs can tell different stories from different places, including conflict zones. The stars of this story are Wagner Mercenaries, a private company funded by Kremlin, soldiers of fortune who do Kremlin's dirty deeds without exposing Kremlin too much. We were very interested to find this suite of an alleged statue dedicated to Russian volunteers somewhere in Luhansk. As you can see on the postament, it's in Russian, it says "Российским добровольцам," which translated into English sounds to Russian volunteers. But if you would cast a quick glance, the uniform on the statue resembles more of a mercenary soldier than a regular Russian army soldier. So what we did, to begin with, we found more photos of the statue to be more convinced that the statue exists and it's not photoshopped. And the second step was to geolocate the actual statue in Luhansk. Well, there are not that many parks in Luhansk, and surely there are not that many parks with a big TV tower in the middle of it. So that was not too hard to do. And at this point, we knew exact location of the statue in Luhansk in Ukraine. But what is more, we stumbled upon another tweet which had an identical statue, and it claimed that the statue was built somewhere in an unidentified place in Syria. And as you can see, the statues are identical, and they were erected only 1 month in between. Furthermore, on the postament, it had the infamous logo of the Wagner statues. So at this point, we knew that the statues were most likely erected to the Russian mercenaries. We did the same. We found more photos. This way, we were convinced that this statue is, also exists. But one of the giveaways that helped us find the exact location was the Arabic text on the postament. It said that Russian volunteers died somewhere in Syria defending oil fields from ISIS. So we took a deep dive into the internet, and we found this video. This video shows ISIS militants blowing up an oil refinery near Palmyra. And it doesn't reveal a lot, but if you would take a deeper look, architectural details resemble the ones that were behind the statue. And we cross-checked it and found out that it was the same plant. It was a clear match. Furthermore, we found this photo of a few lads enjoying a pool, and this gentleman in front is the infamous Alexei Milchakov, a well-known Wagner mercenary who did a lot of war crimes in Ukraine. And apparently he was enjoying the pool at the same location where the statue was erected. So at this point, we knew that Wagner was really operating in the region, but also we knew that most likely this building was HQ of their operations in Syria. So this is a good example of how one picture, one tweet, can not only confirm that Wagner was operating in Ukraine and Syria, but also it gave us exact locations of these statues, of their new monuments. Thanks. Back to you, Eric.
Okay, I'm the final one up for this. And we're going back to Luhansk again, our favorite city in eastern Ukraine, to talk a little bit about how following these breadcrumbs like Lucas, Dinar, and Nika did can help explain murky situations. So some of you may remember back in November of last year, there was a very strange event happening in Luhansk, which is the second largest city in occupied territory in eastern Ukraine. It was the 21st and 22nd of November, and tanks were rolling in. There were soldiers on the streets. Telecom networks were cut. The only thing missing was they weren't playing Swan Lake on TV. And there was a coup, apparent coup of change in leadership up top in Luhansk. So there's a lot of questions exactly who was doing this, right? So there's obviously, at the end of the day, the Kremlin says who is in and who is out in Luhansk and Donetsk, but there is some free will among the various former scammers and mercenaries who lead these puppet republics. So here, for context, Luhansk is the second largest city in the occupied territory. And so when we were trying to understand what was going on, a lot of times traditional investigative journalists are a little bit restricted in this area because it's not exactly an area of super free, unrestricted media. So we try to synthesize information from all sorts of open sources to kind of figure out what's going on, see if we can find any more clues exactly who was running this coup, who was being replaced, and who was behind these mysterious tanks and soldiers that rolled into Luhansk. So for example, here is a Facebook message from the OSCE, which is the only neutral monitoring group allowed in the Donbass. And also a couple of tweets here from a couple of journalists who were operating in Luhansk. So there's a guy, Sergei, on the left, and Alexander Kots, who was probably the most plugged-in Russian journalist into the area. He works from Komsomolskaya Pravda. And he took some photos of this armored personnel carrier on the street of the coup. So you can see right here, it's snowy, it's November in Luhansk. It's not exactly the most inviting location, though we're not one to talk right now. Apparently it's raining out. And this photo as well from Alexander Kotz. And if you look really closely on this armored personnel carrier, this BTR, you have Chechen 771 on it. So here we have some kind of clue. Chechen, of course, Chechen from the the state of Chechnya, well, the semi-state, I guess, of Chechnya. And if we go back and look for more pieces of military equipment that had this Chechen marker on it, and also a 3-digit serial number, we found, for example, this right here, 781 Chekche. You don't have the N at the end, but I promise it's there. And also to the right, you see a logo. It says Pitnashka International Brigade, which is the kind of Republican Guard almost. It's part of this group that's very loyal to Alexander Zakharchenko, who is the leader of the Donetsk Republic. So just by looking at this one picture of this armored personnel carrier, we see the kind of Praetorian Guard of the Donetsk leader is now in Luhansk. So it's, at this point, is it a coup or is it a Donetsk invasion of Luhansk? Because again, these groups are, at the end of the day, Russia says what happens, but they have some free will and they have rivalries and competitions between the groups. So this apparently, at least from this one photo, seemed to be the handiwork of this Donetsk-based group. So we go to next step and we look for more photographs and videos of this Pitnashka group, which is Chechen is kind of a subgroup within Pitnashka. And you see right here, during a military exercise, that exact same armored personnel carrier, 771, participated in some training near Donetsk with a bear, if you look closely. Here's a video from a local TV station showing an interview with somebody from the Pitnashka Brigade, that lovely guy right there. And also, of course, all these places have to have good PR because they want to get recruits, so they have Kontaktia on the Klasniki Twitter profiles. So this is the Kontaktia page for the Pitnashka group. You see they have 20,000 fans, so they're very popular. And then the Chechen Battalion, which is kind of a subgroup within Pitnashka, this kind of group that's loyal to the Donetsk leadership. And from there, you just go and see who the members are, and you go to their profiles, and you can find out more information. This photo was posted during this coup attempt, apparent coup attempt. They all are on vacation from Donetsk. They're in Luhansk. They have a group photo. They're flying the flag here, and you see in the background, you had your geolocation challenge this morning, so you've spent enough time on Google or Yandex Maps, you can figure out it's right here. You see the same gate, the same building. It's pretty easy breezy geolocation. And this is also, as a side note, the OSCE monitors tried to access the location and they were blocked by a bunch of militants. So now we know why, because they were probably based out of this area for their group photo. And also here, they pose here, this is a market in Luhansk with an oinker in the background there. And geolocation is only half the problem, right? So you can, for example, with the hurricane that happened recently in Houston, there were some photos and videos that were being shared that were actually a year old because there was also heavy flooding a year ago in Houston. So geolocation is half of it. You got to figure out the time as well. So we were worried that maybe these photos were 2 or 3 years old and maybe being reshared. We see this pig here in the background. We saw this was actually constructed in October 2017 when it was debuted, which is just a month before this coup attempt. So we know, yes, this is a new photo. This isn't some old recycled thing. We could figure out the exact location, which is this market in Luhansk, and also the time, which is after October 2017, which coincides with the coup attempt. And sometimes they made our job really easy. Here all these tourists are in front of an I Heart Luhansk sign, so we know exactly where they are. So all these half Ukrainian, half Russian, whatever, volunteers are all on a vacation for a coup attempt. And so there's kind of that one photograph, that one armored personnel carrier with Chechen on the side, led us to the profiles of all these people, and we can actually see from their own social media profiles who was behind this mysterious coup in Luhansk. Turns out they were just soldiers from Donetsk who were just executing the will of the Kremlin for them. So next, I think we have some questions. I'm not sure how we pull those up. Actually, we need to ask some questions here in the room before we get to the ones on the app. So do we have a mic runner somewhere? We can ask some questions and I'll hand them off. You can direct your question either to one of the people here or just to me, and then I'll distribute.
Hi there, my name's Brad Chen. I'm with YouTube. I'm an engineering manager. I thought that was an interesting case study where you found a truth that had been hidden. But even having found it, would you say that they were successful in what they were trying to do in that act of deception?
You mean in the coup thing we were just talking about, or something else? Yeah. With that, it's a little bit different because the question is who's going to stop us, right? So who, no one's going to send soldiers into Luhansk to stop this coup because no one really cares about this infighting, right? So when you're thinking about questions about that are a little bit more geopolitically important, when Russia having troops, and where they shouldn't be in Ukraine or Syria, then it's a little bit harder to cover up. That's something that there's a little bit more operational security about nowadays, at least. So in this specific example, the Luhansk thing, they probably weren't trying to hide it too much, just because, again, this is kind of internal squabble between these puppet republics. But for bigger questions about Russians in Ukraine in 2014 and 2015, and Russians in Syria before they had their official announcement of entering troops there, or the Wagner mercenaries who were there freeing the oil fields, for them it's more important, and because then you get the accidental reveals of information. And with that, what you're looking for when you're doing this research is people who are just careless or stupid, right? So maybe they take a photo and they accidentally leave a geotag for where they were. It doesn't happen too much anymore, but it used to all the time. Or a soldier who has all of his photographs, and he has had one photo that accidentally slipped in of him in Ukraine, which happens sometimes as well. So with these things, you're looking for breakdowns of brain farts or operational security or so on. But in the specific Luhansk example, it wasn't really they weren't really hiding it that much. Okay, and so he asked if there's any efforts from their superiors in suppressing it. And yes, there is, but so there have been laws on the books for a while now in Russia that restrict this kind of a thing, but they were just kind of ignored. They've re-strengthened them and kind of reintroduced them. There was these famous posters. I think Lucas wrote about these famous posters that were. Yeah. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
The posters that allegedly were published by Russian military to stop the soldiers from using social media and phones and other software. It is not exactly sure whether or not those were made by Russia itself. It's really hard to confirm that. There were a few instances that those posters were allegedly photographed from the barracks itself, but none of those were also confirmed.
They were kind of like propaganda posters of some soldier. It's like two slides, right? One soldier taking a photo, whatever, and then the background it shows like a CIA operative looking on his page, right? So it's like loose lips sink ships kind of a thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yes, there is, but I don't know how serious it is. Nowadays, the operations in Syria and Ukraine, it's more high-level people. 2014, 2015, you had a lot of grunts, the 22-year-old contract soldiers who didn't know much better. And then you had a lot of information leaking there. Nowadays, it's a lot more veteran and disciplined people, so you don't get as much just because they're smarter. Okay. Maybe we can do one of these questions first before we move to another one in person. How much investment does it run for me? What software required? So maybe Dinar, you want to talk about it because you talked about the Malaysia thing? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So I think the most significant investment that you need to start an effective disinformation monitoring operation is time, because it's a very time-consuming process to, first of all, identify, then verify, and then analyze this information that you find online. And you have to have a lot of patience and an immense amount of objectivity to stay truthful to the truth and report on fact as opposed to resorting to partisanship and opinion sharing. In terms of the software that we're using, we are currently using Systemus to analyze Twitter. It's an excellent social media listening tool. I'd recommend it. And we are also using BuzzSumo, which allows us to see some of the trending stories on social networks, which can then shorten the time it takes for us to understand which stories that could be classified as fake news or disinformation are trending and where we should focus our attention. Because no matter how many of us are digital Sherlocks, there will always be more disinformation than we can tackle. So it's good to have tools that allow you to see which stories matter, because then you can focus your attention on those.
Yeah. on top of that, I think that situational awareness is your first investment. Spend some time to get your head around what is going on. So it will help you to look things up. And by looking things up, I mean basic Googling and using social media search engines or advanced versions of social media search engines that are completely free. And you will start stumbling upon those breadcrumbs, which will lead you to next. And I think passion is the driving force that will help in monitoring disinformation operations and revealing them and analyzing them.
Yeah, I think that time is the most important thing. You can use some software, but usually the best ones don't rely too much on software. And it's really just about creativity and determinedness. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Okay.
Two questions. Is your oh, sorry, I'm Sarah. Thanks. I'm Sarah Finley from South Africa. Two questions. So is the primary sort of outcome of this research to be put into mainstream media, or where does your work, research end up? And secondly, from an African perspective, WhatsApp is an increasingly problematic thing for us. How do you do any analysis, or do you have any suggestions of what can be done about WhatsApp?
I'll answer the second question first, and I'll let someone else take the first one. So really quickly on WhatsApp, and I'll let Lucas answer. It's difficult to monitor WhatsApp because it's 256, right? The groups are 256 people. So on messaging platforms like Telegram, it's tens of thousands of people could be in the same group. But information travels through WhatsApp between these closed groups within friends, and you can't just jump into a group and then monitor it because there's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of groups all over. So that is much more difficult to monitor. And a lot of times when we do monitor it, we see when it leaks into other social networks, right? So a photograph will be, circulated on WhatsApp, but then we'll find its way in Facebook, right? And then you can eventually backtrace it, but it's much more difficult. And I know that there's a lot of people who are working on more sophisticated solutions to do WhatsApp monitoring, but the platform itself, it's difficult to do because of the nature that it was built in. So it's still TBD is my answer, how to do it.
Yeah, in regards to the first question, I think it's twofold. One of the reasons why we do this research is to provide real-time monitoring of a certain event or a certain region, and then our readership, our readers are reading it, but also bigger news media outlets are picking up on the story and use it in wider investigation. But also since all of our research is open source, another goal that we have is to show how to do it. Since you can go through every single step and check it out yourself and use the same methods in the other research, I think that's also a very important educational process that we're doing.
Okay. So want to do another? You want to answer it too, or?
No, there was another question there.
Oh, sure.
Hi, my name is Long Hui. I'm from Malaysia. So I have one question regarding the two hashtags, Kalahkan Pakatan and Say No to PH. So how did the two hashtags have any impact in the recently concluded general election?
No. Well, first of all, as I mentioned, there were only 440 real users who got involved in the campaign, and then the election outcome showed that it didn't have any impact, most likely because it was the opposition coalition who won the election. So we have determined that it didn't, but then other researchers thought that it may have because it had the 2 million impressions. But considering that impressions is such an undefined metric, we tend not to use it because it doesn't really tell you whether or not it changed any people's opinions towards a particular subject or a political party. It only tells you that someone saw it, and that gives us no data, essentially.
Mm-hmm. And among those impressions include bots too, right?
Exactly, yeah, precisely.
So you don't have humans working those, yeah. Let's do another of these questions. How do you know if a breadcrumb is worth pursuing? Nika or Lucas, you want to take that one?
Yeah, so short answer is that you don't, up until you discover something. So again, situational awareness helps if it's relevant to check if if it has been manipulated, is it really happening? Then you follow down, and sometimes, so it's very easy oftentimes to fall into the conspiracy thinking mindset that there's something that is behind the scenes, but oftentimes it proves to be a case that things are much more simple than we expect at first. So if your breadcrumb doesn't lead you anywhere and you have spent like, I don't know, day already, then maybe it's not worth pursuing it further.
And as a closing note, as I've been told to shut down, another thing that the journalists in the room should also consider is if something should be worth covering or debunking. Because if it's some obscure hoax that only 5 people have seen, if your major news organization publishes something about it, you just shine a spotlight on it, and 1 million more people are going to see it who ever would have. So with this thing, it's kind of keep it in your back pocket, right? Verify it and be ready in case it gets larger. But thinking about that threshold of when to cover something and when it's not worth it is very important and very valuable for a lot of people in this room. Okay, so I'm going to hand off now to Sam from Amnesty International, and as we make our way off the stage.
Thank you very much, Eric, and thank you also very much to Graham and to Elliot and the whole of the Atlantic Council for having us at Amnesty International talk about what we're doing around verification. My name is Sam Doubley. I've been working with Amnesty International now for around 2 years. I was brought in to build this program I'm going to talk to you about, which is called the Digital Verification Corps. I think of the name as a Digital Verification Corps a little bit like that rock band that had the surprise hit record and then can't change their name. I'm not so fond of the name, but we're kind of stuck with it because it's gone quite well. So I'm going to talk to you about the DVC and how that's set up and why it's working well for Amnesty as a model for engaging people around the world in the process of verification. And then I was going to talk to you about one of the case studies that we did in some of the research we've done surrounding Yemen, and how actually we're learning as we move along how digital investigations can actually support Amnesty's core research. And that's actually becoming more and more important. So that's some of our Digital Verification Corps volunteers. Now, Amnesty is fundamentally a grassroots volunteer organization, one of the biggest human rights organizations, NGOs in the world. And we set up, we were faced over the last 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, with the problem of how to use videos and photographs that were increasingly being sent to Amnesty researchers. In most cases, we have 1 researcher per country, or 1 or 2 researchers per thematic issue. And often they get overwhelmed. They have contacts in the country themselves who are sending them messages via WhatsApp. And we have a big problem with WhatsApp. I don't know who asked that question before, but it's an increasing challenge as the social messaging apps. And our researchers are often overwhelmed with doing the fundamental research of understanding what's going on in the country, but also then suddenly having to look at these videos or photographs that they were being sent by contacts within a country and say, what do I do with this? How do I integrate this into my research? A few years ago, we actually built a tactical research team, which is a team of 2 people. So more than 1, I guess we can call it a team. But we often get overwhelmed as well. So it's how do you actually remain a volunteer organization and actually deal with this new challenge? So that's kind of where the Digital Verification Corps came from. We have a lot of people around the world, and this is a big conference we had last year in San Francisco, and after this I'm going to introduce one of our partners at UC Berkeley, Alexa Koenig, because they're one of our great partners, and last year we had a meeting of all our volunteers from around the world who came together in San Francisco. So it's very much about people. It's very much about not only verifying content, but also spreading skills around verification into the general human rights community. And what better way to do it, and I heard Ben talk about 9-year-olds before, but what better way to do it than also engage with university students. And when those people eventually get jobs, they go into other NGOs, governments, international organizations with the skills of verification. So we started the DVC in September 2016, and we thought at first, well, in the first year, maybe we'll contribute to 3 research reports, a press release here and there. We actually contributed to over 50 Amnesty International research projects. And I mean ranging from big research reports into countries to press releases to actually debunking as well and telling an Amnesty researcher, oh, be careful of that one. You don't want to be using that picture. Because at the end of the day, the biggest capital that Amnesty International has as an organization is its reputation. And if we put out content that we've been given by a contact that turns out to be incorrect, that's going to cost us a lot of reputation dollars. So we're very, very careful about that. The amazing thing about the program is that it's given us around 10,000 work hours from volunteers who are actually contributing directly into research. The benefit is, obviously, I don't need to explain what the benefit of that is, both in terms of financially and manpower, resources. It's really huge. So it's really been a beneficial model for Amnesty International as an organization. What does that look like? So we set up the program with universities. We did an initial trial before I came on board about 3 or 4 years ago, where we actually just said, hey, does anybody want to volunteer to verify content? And we found that to be a very problematic model for Amnesty. And I'll go into some of the reasons why we think that's problematic as I go along. But we now have 6 global universities in our network. We have the University of Hong Kong. We have the University of Pretoria. We have 2 universities in the United Kingdom, the University of Essex and the University of Cambridge. And we have the University of Toronto in Canada, and we have UC Berkeley in California in the United States. We wanted to make sure that this was, in some ways at least, a global project. Often we see these projects kind of being focused in the global north, but we wanted to make sure, as Amnesty itself has become a somewhat spread out organization with regional offices around the world in Mexico City, Johannesburg, Colombo, moving away from that everything in London model, we wanted to make sure also that the DVC was in that way, and we're able to then pass the skills of verification around the world into different communities. Why students? It was very important for us. One thing nobody's talked about so far this morning, but when you're looking at videos of conflict, you're looking at a lot of very, very graphic and violent content. I think probably more so in Amnesty's work and the human rights work than in many other organizations. But this is something that's very much at the forefront of our mind when we're engaging with this content. You might then say, well, why are you engaging with young people? Surely it should be older, more mature people who are working with this. I would disagree. I think having young people who are nonetheless adults engaging with this content in a safe environment, where they're able to actually evaluate if this work is something that they want to do, but they're also in a structured environment with pastoral care, where if somebody feels uncomfortable looking at, frankly, dead children in Yemen or Syria, or violent episodes elsewhere, in Myanmar, I can think of as an example, they're very free to say, number one, I don't want to do this. I think when you're working with Human Rights Watch and you've just paid the deposit on an apartment in Brooklyn, you're not very able to say, no, I want to do this. If you're a student, you can actually walk away. But we also have a pastoral care system inbuilt. So that was why one of the main reasons, along with sharing the skills and spreading skills, we wanted to engage with universities. Amnesty was very much based around letter writing, right? I remember my mom in the early 80s kind of sitting around the kitchen table writing letters. Volunteering for Amnesty. I like to think of the DVC basically as the Amnesty letter writers of 2018. So people who are actually giving to the human rights movement, but in a new, engaged, digital way that actually gives something to the organization that wasn't there before. And I think being able to do that at scale is a real plus of this program. So I also thought when we started this program, we would just basically be doing Syria. It turns out lots of people are filming lots of things all around the world. And we've covered countries all over the place. Madagascar, I was looking at just last week. Venezuela, we've been looking at a lot recently. Nicaragua, the recent police violence in Nicaragua. We've been looking at videos from Guinea, from Nepal, from Qatar, from Libya, all over the world. Really, what I didn't really think we would be doing when we first started this. We've had 2 very, very big successes. One was on Manus Island, the Australian detention centre, the illegal Australian detention centre last year, where we managed to actually, through using digital verification alone, change the narrative of the government around an event that impacted on the safety of the refugees and the migrants in that detention centre. And also recently, you may have seen Amnesty put out a press release last week about Kirin Beer investing in Myanmar during the ethnic cleansing last September and August and September. We just happened to see a video of Aung San Min Aung Hlaing, the Supreme Commander of the Burmese Army, accepting money from companies to fund the military. And within that was one of the companies that Kirin, the Japanese beer company, had invested in Myanmar. So we were able, through the DVC, to actually also look at the business side of human rights as well. We've also covered a wide range of thematic issues. I thought it would just be conflict, but open source investigation also lends itself to migration, to right to assembly, extrajudicial executions, conflict, torture, and arms sales as well. So a wide range of areas we've been able to investigate into. So I wanted to talk to you also just quickly through one of the case studies, how we looked at it, maybe give you some tips on how we work. Very recently, we had a team in Aden in Yemen. It's very hard for Amnesty to get into Yemen, but we were able to do it. And we were asked by that team while we were there, who were doing interviews. They conducted 34 interviews in Aden of people who'd fled the conflict in the northwest of the country. And we were asked to help them out by verifying audiovisual content. Now, we had somebody in the field, and she sent me a WhatsApp message saying, this is how we were communicating. I think this is an interesting facet of open source investigation. Obviously, that's not very readable. So she was interested in 2 coalition airstrikes. She'd been conducting interviews and had been told by people in Aden, oh, we had to flee Hodeidah in the northwest of Yemen because of these 2 airstrikes. One in Zubayd on January the 3rd, 9 people killed, she was told, 9 people injured. And another in an area called Al-Jarai on January the 1st, where the person she was interviewing was told about 20 people killed maybe and 8 wounded. Now, my colleague who was there was like, I want to know that this is true as I'm doing the interviews. Can the DVC help me out? And this was a very new way of working for us. Previously, people had just come to us with videos, but then we were actually being asked to corroborate first-hand interviews that were being taken by a researcher in the field. So she was in Aden. Little map of Yemen for you, for those who aren't realized. And obviously, it's very dangerous, Yemen, of course, at the moment. There's no way she could go herself and check these out. Maybe 20 years ago, an Amnesty researcher could have got in a battered, VW Beetle, put tape on the windscreen, and off they went. Today, obviously, that's impossible. And also, the research had to be done while the team was in Yemen. They wanted to actually come back, get back to New York, and put out the press release as we were there. So we were on a quite a heavy time constraint. So we had 4 of our DVC teams. How we work is when a piece of work comes in, we kind of just put it out to tender. Who's available? And we had teams from Cambridge, Essex, Berkeley, and Toronto get to work. That brings with it its own problems of collaboration, of course, across time zones, across countries, across different working cultures. And during the whole of the research period, we discovered over 60 pieces of content and verified and geolocated 12 videos, which meant that our researcher was actually then able to say, OK, that person told me about this airstrike. I can actually vouch for it. And we're going to look at the one in Al-Jarai. So first of all, what did we do? We started searching for evidence. This is kind of a new area for us. We used to be just given videos, but now we're actually also searching for evidence. Lots of different tools to use there. We also have access to some of the more paying tools, such as Data-Miner. But actually, what we found to be one of the most useful tools to use is a little plugin built by European Union money, by a joint project between the broadcaster Deutsche Welle here in Berlin and the French Press Association, AFP. This is a great little plugin which allows you to do Twitter advanced search. The thing I love about the Invid plugin is it's a full Swiss Army knife of verification. You can do all sorts of different analysis. I'm just showing you the Twitter advanced search. This you can also do in Twitter itself, but actually it's quite complicated. And this actually just makes it a a nice, usable interface for doing quick research on Twitter. So we pulled out, there we go. So we did a name search of the location in English and in Arabic. I've often experimented with like also then throwing in, airstrike or dead or killed, people. Actually, for our work, especially if you're looking at somewhere a little bit more remote, as for us, Yemen is a little bit, using just a name search, the location search in English and in Arabic, using Boolean search terms, so the English term or the Arabic term, gives a broader base of results. We're looking obviously at the date of the event, and the great thing about the Twitter Advanced Search in the InVid plugin is it will give you that little bit more precise date timings. You can even go to hour, the tweet you're looking for to restrict that search parameters. And then we were looking for content with media. So we weren't so interested in just people writing about it. We actually wanted to find content with media. You can also search for videos or photos. I find just searching for media, because that encompasses photos and videos and GIFs, et cetera, is a lot more useful in terms of what we're doing to actually get content in there that then we can filter down. Step 2 then was collecting and archiving content. We make a big effort always to archive content. And Alexa and I will probably talk about this a little bit later. Increasingly, content goes missing. And I've seen it during an investigation into particularly Syria. You found that one video that you want to look at, and then 30 seconds later it's gone. So when you find a piece of content, we always take great steps to archive it as well. We use a collaborative platform for our verification called Truly Media. There are several out there. We quite like Truly because it allows us to answer a certain set of verification questions and allows lots of people in different time zones in different countries to work together collaboratively. So this is one we use. There are other ones out there, though. The other important thing is, with Truly that I like a lot is the ability to call something graphic. If you look at the image on the far right there, we were able to flag it as graphic, which meant that somebody else who was then coming to look at it isn't suddenly hit with a very gory image that they might not want to see and they might not be ready to see. So then we start the verification. First thing we always do, and I have heard it mentioned several times, so sorry for repeating this, but I think it is so important that it's worth repeating, is reverse image search. So we always check to see if something has appeared online before. This doesn't tell you when it's been taken, of course, but it tells you if it's appeared online before and if you need to dismiss it. Today, at least, I think we find most, certainly terms in conflict, most of the content that is false, that is wrong, is not photoshopped in any way. It's actually just somebody saying it happened somewhere else at a different time. So reverse image search really helps us on that. And then we spent time doing the actual geolocation. We also did the game before, so you're probably all experts at this now. We always use Google Earth Pro for verification, not the Google Earth, the web version. Because Google Earth Pro, the one big advantage is it allows you to look at historical satellite imagery. And that can be very, very important, especially if we're looking at airstrikes and we want to compare before or after, but also in kind of like just looking at the angles of buildings. Satellite images aren't taken at the same place at the same angle every single time. So you'll often get different angles of the building that will allow you different visions if you're looking at it. So this is one of the airstrikes we were looking at, and we found the content. And we were pretty sure it was in this place. And we found the content, and we found several pieces. I've taken screenshots here of the videos. And already in these pictures, this obviously took quite a while to do, but we have the petrol station, the gas station that was hit, and we can see that connected to lots of different trees in the background, the building there, the orange and white building in the foreground, another building that's being partially built just next to the man's head on the right there, and then the shape of the road. So we were able to very confidently say, by doing that corroboration of location, checking it's not appeared online before, that yes, that interview that you'd had with that person who said 20 people have been killed in this place. We can confirm that an airstrike did happen there. And there were lots of gory pictures of dead families as well. So we could actually say there were civilian casualties in this airstrike. So then we were able to actually write back to the team who were in Yemen and say, yes, we were able to confirm this airstrike in this location. And then when my colleague actually did the press release, she was able to know that 25 people worked to discover and verify the content that was used in that press release, which looked like that. And what the research team actually told us was this work helped us corroborate the eyewitness testimony and show the impact of the violence in Yemen. So there we have it. We're doing this increasingly more and more. Amnesty's got a very big report on Myanmar coming out next week that I'd encourage you all to, of course, to look at. In that, there's a whole host of DVC work that we did to help show what was going on in Myanmar on all sides of the conflict. Amnesty's role is to monitor violations of international humanitarian law on all sides of conflict. And this report very much indicates that. So thank you very much. I'd now like to ask my dear colleague, Alexa Koenig, the Executive Director of the Human Rights Center at Berkeley, UC Berkeley, to come on stage to talk us a little bit more about accountability. When we were first setting up this, when I was first setting up the DVC, I called Alexa and I was like, I've got this idea, do you want to be in? And Alexa, thank God, was one of the first people to say, yes, we're in. So it's my great pleasure to have you here, Alexa.
Thank you. Thanks. And thank you for having me here. I want to talk a little bit about the legal side of accountability. There's obviously the social components of accountability, where a lot of the work that's being done right now by open source investigators is feeding into policy change and different arguments made across media sources, et cetera. But a big piece of what I've been trying to think about is how do you adapt a lot of these methodologies so that they rise to the level of forensic standards and can ultimately be used in courts of law around the world to hold people to account. So I want to start actually with a story. It's Argentina, 1976, March, and a young man named Eric Stover is backpacking through the country. He has a letter from the Associated Press in his backpack, and he's with his brother. And lo and behold, of course, in March 1976, what actually ends up happening on the day that he's there is we have the military coup. Like a lot of young people at the time, he's beaten up and he's thrown into prison, where he'll spend the night watching other young individuals be thrown in that jail cell with him. They'll rip their shirts and they'll bandage up their wounds. The next morning, he'll be ejected from the country, and he'll be sent to Brazil and told not to come back. Most of the men with whom he was jailed that night were never, of course, heard from again. And he credits having an American passport with having saved his life. Fast forward to 1983, and he's now at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And he's told that 3 women have come from Argentina to see them. They will be the grandmothers at the Plaza del Mayo, who I'm sure many of you have heard about. And one of those women will pull from her purse a crumpled newspaper clipping about a new technology and a new use of that technology to try and identify the bodies of individuals. The technology is, of course, DNA analysis. And one of the things that she's read about in this paper is that you can now use DNA analysis to determine paternity. And her question for Eric is, can you also use this technology to determine grandpaternity? All 3 women had had daughters who either were pregnant when they were taken into captivity, or they heard rumors later that their daughters had become pregnant in captivity. And one of the techniques used by the military junta at the time had been to keep young women alive until they gave birth, because to kill them when they had an unborn child inside them would, of course, be to kill a fetus. So they would allow the women to give birth and put that baby in their arms for a few hours, and then take that baby, adopt it out to different families, and kill the woman. So these were now the remaining grandmothers who knew that their grandchildren were probably out there somewhere, but they had no idea where. And they wanted to know if Eric could help find them and use this technology. And he said, I don't know. But he said, I bet I can find people who do. So he went to the Berkeley campus in California, and he found a geneticist who could maybe think through some of the technological implications of what could be done. He went and found a guy named Clyde Snow, who was a forensic anthropologist, and he brought them both down to Argentina. And he thought he was going to find a number of professionals there in the country who would help them exhume bodies, because that was one of the big pieces of what they were being asked to do, was to unearth these mass grave sites, and or to use this kind of technology to find the living. Well, nobody would touch it, perhaps unsurprisingly, with a 10-foot pole, because to do so would have been still far too dangerous. So what he ended up doing instead was going to the local university, and he found that there were a number of students who were hungry to figure out what had been happening in their country and to figure out how they could use the educations that they were getting to make some kind of difference. So he pulled together this team of students, and they began digging up bodies and figuring out new methodologies for identifying the deceased and working with the living, the family members who'd been looking for their loved ones. And what he found, this particular team ended up becoming the Argentine Forensic Anthropology team, which went on to help create accountability in the former Yugoslavia, in Iraq, et cetera. And we now have an entire global network of people who are doing this work. Well, just like DNA analysis was at some point new, just like satellite imagery was at some point new and needed to be brought into legal processes, I think we're seeing a very similar phenomenon today, where we're just now beginning to understand how we can really capitalize on the digital methodologies that are out there, the large quantities of information that are being uploaded to social media and to other platforms, and begin to comb that for evidence. That brings me to the biggest lesson learned that I've learned from working with Eric, who's now my boss. And that is the power of students and how they are often very untapped potential, how what they want more than anything else is to make a meaningful contribution. So we began to talk in early 2015, 2016, can we be a Robin Hood of sorts from the extraordinary resources on a 55,000 person campus like UC Berkeley and start pulling together people from the very different disciplines and methodologies that can maybe do something with online information. So we began to go around, my colleague Andrea Lampros and I, and go to every department that we could think of that was relevant. Computer science to investigative journalism to law and legal studies to anthropology, sociology, and see if there might be 5 or 6 students who wanted to do this work. Well, that first semester, right after Sam had called me and said, hey, we're starting this digital verification core, do you want in? And I had responded, actually, we're trying to do something similar, and yes, we do, is that once we put the word out there, all of a sudden, we were having to shut the floodgates from students, because we were not prepared yet to have the kind of overwhelming kind of response that we actually received. So the first semester started with 42 students. By this past semester, we had 80 students in the lab, the Human Rights Investigations Lab that we launched. They came from 22 different majors, and they speak a collective 31 different languages. Nonprofit human rights organizations cannot pay 80 people in most instances. They can't find people with 31 different languages. We have the extraordinary luxury of if we are dealing with a conflict that suddenly erupted in an obscure place in the world, there's probably at least one person on the Berkeley campus who speaks that language, and we can try and see if they're an appropriate person to bring into this work. Now that lab is being run by Phelan McMahon. One of the things that I think distinguishes us a little bit from some of the other amazing members of the Digital Verification Corps is that we started working along 2 tracks. One for human rights investigations, and another for legal investigations. So our other first partner was actually a human rights law firm that didn't really know how this online digital content could maybe help their caseloads. They were doing the traditional methods of interviewing witnesses. And we began to say, all right, let us just experiment a little bit, and let us see if we can actually find some stuff to help your case. And that has been an extraordinary fruitful partnership, in part, and I'll just give you one quick example of how. So the lawyers thought they had a case, and I'm actually going to change a lot of the details, but I'll keep them close enough that you get the gist. But they thought they had a case of domestic murder, and they wanted to investigate this murder, and they asked our students to go through a bunch of videotapes they had relative to where this murder had taken place, and we did a lot of the verification of that content. But then our students said, can we do a little bit more? Maybe we can go online and see what else is out there. And so the students went onto YouTube, and they started pulling up just large quantities of video that had been uploaded around the same incident, the same place. And they shared those results with the lawyers. And all of a sudden, the lawyers went, oh my gosh, this isn't a domestic case anymore. This is an international criminal case. Because what the students' large volumes of YouTube videos was able to do was show a pattern that gave you the elements of something having been systematic and widespread, which is what you need to elevate a normal everyday crime in a domestic jurisdiction into something much bigger. So there's a lot of techniques that we're beginning to experiment with that I think are really, really critical. But one other issue is that there are currently no standards for doing open source investigations as a form of evidence in international criminal tribunals. So we're doing a lot of research right now to find what guidance is out there, to try and give guidance to those NGOs that want to make sure that their work can potentially have legal impact. A big piece of how that started was along the same time after Eric came back from AAAS. He started the Human Rights Center at UC Berkeley, where I'm now the executive director. And one of my first assignments when I first began working there was he said, Alexa, there's a question in front of us. We'd started working with the International Criminal Court. And he said, the question is, why are so many of their cases falling apart at fairly early stages of prosecution? These are really well-known incidences with really high-level war crimes perpetrators. The general media knows what's going on, but why are these crumbling? So we sent a PhD student to the court to embed with the court and look at what was going on. And what she came back and said was, the judges are all saying that they're over-relying on two things: NGO reports, which they're saying aren't evidence, and two, and even more importantly, they're over-relying on witness testimony. And with time and trauma, you put a witness who's basically gone through an atrocity up on the stand, they can be discredited, they can be terrorized into not showing up in the first place. And what the judges were saying is, you need to give us more. So my job from 2012 on began to think through, what are the other kinds of information that we can be bringing into these prosecution strategies? And we began to host a series of workshops to bring together people who are experimenting with new digital technologies and trying to think through their applicability to legal cases. Everything from remote sensing to capitalizing on smartphones and the ways that people are beginning to grab content around conflict, and Witness has been a phenomenal partner in thinking through the potential of video as evidence, to thinking through how big data analytics can be utilized as a mechanism. We've recently had two big breakthroughs at the International Criminal Court. One was the Al-Mahdi case. Al-Mahdi involved Mali, the country of Mali, and destruction of cultural heritage property in Timbuktu. There was an investigator at the International Criminal Court who put together the first open source investigations report, hundreds of pages of open source content, and introduced it, and it was introduced as evidence for the first time at the ICC back when they were litigating this case. Now, the bummer for the open source community is that the defendant, thankfully for international justice, pled guilty, which meant that that particular report was never tested as a form of evidence in court. So we're still waiting to see how the judges respond to these things. The second big breakthrough was, of course, in August 2017 in the al-Warfali case involving Libya. And there, in August 2017, the ICC issued its first ever arrest warrant, where the facts underlying the basis for the warrant were primarily derived from social media content, so content that had been pulled from Facebook and from Twitter. And so one of the things that we're now beginning to see in terms of international criminal justice and accountability is that this has tremendous potential. So I want to fast forward really quickly. I skipped over most of these slides. I want to show you a little bit about what we're working on today. In October 2017, we hosted a workshop in Bellagio, Italy, to bring together people that had worked for most of the major war crimes tribunals, representatives of NGOs like Witness and Amnesty International, people that were doing open source investigations from Bellingcat, from the Syrian Archive, to begin to talk about how we could improve the system of accountability. One of the things we released was a report called The New Forensics. We realized that even definitional terms are not set in terms of international criminal law. We need to know what we're talking about in order to have an informed conversation. And one thing that we're working on now is trying to develop an international protocol on open source investigations. The idea is that we will help to bring some basic standards to the space, much like what happened with DNA analysis and with satellite imagery, so that people understand where their work can have potential utility for court systems. It's an inclusive process. We want to have everyone who has any interest in this work engaged. We have an extraordinary editorial committee that was just pulled together from a number of people from the open source space, but also from the major international criminal tribunals who understand that workflow and the challenges inherent to it. And then also people who have had, quite literally, the experience of building international protocols and guidelines. And now we're trying to build working groups with different people with different expertise to critique this document with the overarching objective that we hope to get it released fairly soon. So I'm going to land on some final principles before I call Sam back up. Some of the principles that began to emerge from this conversation that I think are important for people who are open source investigators but aren't lawyers, but may want their work to have legal weight, is the following. The first is the principle of impartiality. The need for when you're sourcing online resources to grab both incriminating and exonerating information. There's also the principle of independence. So making sure that the work that you're doing is free from subjective interests of any individuals and institutions. The third is considerations of security, so physical security, digital security, and also psychosocial security. I think in terms of working with students, that's been one of the biggest challenges, is figuring out how do you best prepare them to deal with the kinds of content that they're often grappling with for very long periods of time. And of course, psychosocial vulnerabilities open up concerns with the other forms of security as well. Accountability, so having transparency of methods, creating some kind of system of peer review, blind peer review when it's needed. We need to develop a community of experts who can testify in court, and figuring out even who is someone who could be considered an open source investigator with the right experience and credibility to actually get up there on stand. Legality, and that's very jurisdiction specific. What is going to get your information kicked out of court? What are the exclusionary rules for introducing information as evidence? At the International Criminal Court, for example, they have very flexible rules of admitting information in, but one exclusionary rule is you can't have violated human rights when you're grabbing that information. So for those of us who may use some degree of subterfuge or masked who we are online in violation of terms of service agreements, community guidelines, or even in cases of law and regulation, that might be a particular consideration to think through. Equality, how does using digital technologies ultimately shift our focus, potentially away from certain kinds of crimes that are maybe not as readily captured online, like sexual violence, and further exacerbate that problem? Or privilege, cases that are coming out of areas where there's a high degree of penetration of digital technologies over other places. And then lastly, preservation. So the need to really grab things. The problem with international criminal justice is that we're often looking at cases 5 years, 10 years, 30 years after an event has occurred. So how do we think through how to grab now and preserve safely now what's happening so that there can be later accountability? And I think I'm running low on time, so thank you. I will.
So, Alexa and I are going to have a little chat, which I think is a bit weird, a circle, but we'll work it out. But if anybody has any questions, it'd be great to get the questions up on the screen already, so maybe we could just dip into them as we go along through our chat. And if anybody has any now, maybe, already, or we can just... I was going to start off because I've not been so closely involved in building the Bellagio principles, but I'm very interested in them. How you think... for an organization like Amnesty or the work that the DVC is doing, how can we, not necessarily very interested in legal accountability, but not necessarily working towards legal accountability always, how can we build those kind of principles into the work the DVC is doing?
I think a big piece of it is being aware of what could create challenges if you do want your work to have potential impact later on. A big issue that's come up when we're hosting a lot of these workshops and NGOs are looking to get involved is that there are some who this is just so far outside their mandate, they don't want to have their work in any way perverted by thinking through the legal constraints. But there are also a lot of NGOs who are collecting information rapidly who I think do want to have that opportunity down the line. So I think there's a basic awareness. In law schools, we're just not training, at least in the United States, around these issues right now. I think I taught probably the first law school class on open source investigations as a form of evidence collection last spring. So I do think it's an awareness process. I don't even think there's international consensus yet, though, about how we should be thinking this through. A big piece of it may be experimentation. So trying to see where we could have, the DVC could have input into some of the cases that are currently ongoing, like Libya, which is very much a current conflict. The great work that Bellingcat and others have done in grabbing that information I've been hearing so frequently, how it's so important to have parallel investigations often running that can be used as a check. I think it's also very helpful with the takedowns on social media right now to have other groups that are grabbing content. A big challenge, though, is how to signal to international justice mechanisms, hey, we've got this, without potentially endangering yourself. It's a coordination thing, though, more than anything else.
And I always, especially regarding the pulling downs, I'm always very worried about doing it in the right way, or just doing it at all, right? So sometimes we're doing it so fast that you don't know if we're doing it in the right way. So we take a screen grab, or the good tool doesn't work, so we use another tool which might not actually work in legal accountability, but it works well enough for advocacy, which is something I worry about a lot. And like there doesn't seem to be any tools out there yet, the right sort of tools that are widespread in usage that allow us to archive in a systematic and rigorous way.
Well, I think there are tools like Hunchly that tries to grab information from, say, Facebook and Twitter and grab all of the content around that and all of the links that are potentially helpful, but that, of course, sucks up a lot of space and time and money. The biggest, I think, piece of the preservation principle is just do what you can and be prepared to talk about why you did it that way, and if sometimes it's a lack of resources. Jurisdictions are shifting quickly in what they'll find okay. So in the beginning, when you saw digital content coming into a lot of different court systems, they were saying, all right, a screen grab is fine. Now they're expecting sometimes higher standards, and they want documentation. At a bare minimum, if you're just doing a screen grab, to at least keep a notebook where you're writing down who did the grab, when they grabbed it, what they used to grab it, what computer it was done on. That log becomes chain of custody, so that you can actually show and then testify in court if necessary about why you did what you did and who did it and when. And I think those basic principles underlie everything.
A couple of times I've actually asked somebody to film me taking a screen grab.
Yeah, that's
just
great.
Just in case.
That's great.
Which seems a bit weird, right? But anyway, so there's a couple of questions. I think that one's quite interesting at the top. In such a new field, how do you ensure credibility and expertise when engaging in something as high stakes as legal cases? I mean, certainly on the amnesty side there, what I was trying to show with the Yemen thing is actually we're coming probably to a conclusion that open source used alone, and it would be interesting to see how the Werfli case goes, used alone opens you up to quite a lot of potential risk. And increasingly, I think we're finding we use it as another pillar of evidence to like strengthen the arch of evidence, if you like, including, local human rights defender testimony, witness testimony, and then having the open source evidence to back up that claim that you're trying to make actually then leads towards this kind of credibility and expertise. Yeah. I mean, I don't know what you...
I think one of the biggest things that I failed to mention earlier was working from a place of having multiple working hypotheses. So something that's really important with something this high stakes, and this came up in when Liz was talking as well, which is you need to know what the other side is going to argue. Ideally, as a legal investigator, you don't have a side. You're going out there and you're objectively combing resources and building a record around them. It's up to the lawyers to then make something of that very neutral information. I think what happens on the NGO side a lot is we do have a side, and it can be very difficult to see things from a very different perspective. But one of the things I would usually say to first-year law students is if you can't argue the other side's case even better than you can argue your own, then you're kind of dropping the ball, because you need to have done that objective overview first, made the arguments from every possible angle so that you can anticipate what the challenges are going to be going forward. I know there's a lot of challenges, though, in doing that documentation. One thing you had been talking to me about earlier was the ways that tools are constantly changing. So I think one of the things we've been focusing on in the protocols is not being very tool-specific because it is happening so fast. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of the changing landscape around what's...
Yeah, I mean, I think we're finding it very difficult to constantly keep up with how the big social media platforms are changing everything without any discussion, without any consultation with us as NGO spaces. For instance, Google Earth Pro used to have a wonderful facility called Panoramio, which was set up in 2005, bought by Google, integrated into Google Earth Pro, and then about 2 months ago, shut down. Now, we were told it was going to happen for about a year, but we have like this whole archive of 12 years or so of images that are just suddenly no longer available to us, which were phenomenally useful for geolocation because people had put them on their holiday trips all around the world. So Syria, Libya, DRC, Myanmar. There's all these Panoramio pictures that were there, and believe it or not, there's no Google Street View shock. So these things actually often replace Google Street View for us in a strange way, and then suddenly they're gone, and everybody's told, oh, you can just put them on the new Google Maps, which is now like, 3 pictures compared to what was 50. And that's just one example. The other example being last summer, and the Syrian Archive guys, I'm sure, who are here, will talk about that later. The YouTube AI just decided to take down around 400,000 videos. Again, no discussion, no engagement with civil society, no engagement with an NGO like Amnesty. And that just happening, and us kind of putting our faith in these publicly traded companies that want to maximize shareholder profit and not really listen to NGOs, even though they say they do, is very problematic, I think. I find that very difficult to work with. I don't know, have you found that?
So I think mine's been less on the pragmatic side and more on the policy side, but that and I know we're standing between you and lunch, which is never a good place to be. The only thing worse is probably between you and drinks. But a big piece of it has been what's driving the takedowns in the first place. And I think trying to get at the bottom of some of that, one of the things that I think is a challenge is a lot of the narrative right now is being driven by counterterrorism objectives, which of course mandates bringing content down and doing it quickly. And of course that's increasingly automated. The second is the new privacy regulations that have recently gone into effect. Privacy also mandating information being taken down. What I think doesn't have necessarily equal weight at this particular time is the freedom of expression kind of angle from a human rights perspective, or from an international legal accountability perspective, it's needing access to information. And so how do we maximize the potential of dealing with the very legitimate concerns around privacy and combating terrorism at the same time that we're ensuring access to information in ways that are really critical for getting people like Oliver Foley from executing dozens of people at a time. And I see maybe we could have one more question before we...
Yeah. The bottom one, we wanted to talk about deep fakes, didn't we? So how could legal structures cope with the possibility of perfect digital fakes being used as evidence?
Yeah.
So
I think we both are probably very similarly aligned on a lot of that. I think there's 2 different ways to think about it. One, of course, is in the digital forensic space. It's an arms race. People are constantly getting better at detecting manipulation of imagery at the same time that people are getting better at making near perfect fakes. But I think one of the most critical things, and this is where I think the Digital Verification Corps and the proliferation of training students to go out in the world with this in their minds, is the importance of having the mindset of questioning the validity of information in the first place, and B, having some basic tools at your disposal to check that information. So I think a lot of times the deep fakes conversation right now is happening almost as if those videos are going to rise in a vacuum, as opposed to being surrounded by a lot of other content that can hopefully be used to triangulate and corroborate whether this is in fact valid information or is potentially fake. It's going to get harder and harder. But I do think that we need to be thinking about the entire ecosystem of information and not these particular tools in isolation.
Totally, and I guess I would add to that that if we have, certainly as Amnesty, if we have one video in a vacuum, which is showing something that we think is a potential human rights violation that we could potentially want to react to, but we have no other corroborating evidence around that, and we're not able to independently verify it, where it happened, who the people were, are the military uniforms the right one, then our advice to our researchers and to our campaigners is best to stay quiet. And we had a very good example of that last year with a video from Algeria, which showed some migrants from sub-Saharan Africa who had been captured by what we were told was the Algerian military. And they were basically being tortured. They were being sat in a circle and made to hit each other, otherwise the soldiers would hit them harder. It was a really distressing, horrible video. Don't go look for it. But it was all over the Algerian media. But we couldn't verify where it was. There was no pictures, there was no video of we just saw the legs of the soldiers. We couldn't see their lapels or anything like that. They were speaking a mixture of French and Arabic, which was probably the only real indicator in the video of where it was taken and who the people were. But we just couldn't have enough to stake put some of our reputation dollars on this being real, so the advice was not to do anything. And I think that stands with the deep fakes. It's just another part of the research we have to do, and we have to always remember to go back to the basics of verification. Is one of the things I think is most important.
Great. And I know we ran out of time to talk about the protocol and other stuff, but if you do have any interest in engaging with the protocol or have questions for me about that, please do let me know, because we're looking to make this as inclusive as possible.
Thank you, all of you. for
Thank
your
you.
time. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's it for the morning. I think you'll agree we've had a fantastic morning. We've been geolocating things. We've been looking at the 4Ds of disinformation. We've been looking at breadcrumbs. We've had great stuff on justice and accountability. If you don't feel like Sherlock's already, then by the end of the afternoon, you definitely will. We're now going to break for lunch. Just a couple of housekeeping points. For those of you who are working on devices whose batteries are running low, we've got a whole series of PowerPoints down to the left and down to the right. So please be civilized in how you fight for the PowerPoints, but those who need to recharge can recharge, because a digital Sherlock with no electricity is an analog Sherlock, which is much, much harder work. Lunch is set up at the back. We need to be back in and kicking off again at 1:25, so that gives us a 45-minute lunch break. Slightly less than we would have hoped, but there is a happy hour this evening where there'll be all the time in the world for contact building and network building. So everybody, guten Appetit.